Okay, happy to be here in Florence. Let me just make sure that I have the presentation right here. As Federica said, this is the most comprehensive review of the findings. It looks at the entire fifth wave, but it also attempts to compare the findings of the latest wave with the other waves. We've done 5 so far. The latest one is also the most comprehensive and the largest in terms of sample size. We've interviewed 25,000 people in 12 countries. The presentation today will focus on just 11. Kuwait was the 12th, and I'm not going to be referring to Kuwait. The data from Kuwait arrived a little late for me to be able to enter. The previous waves, the first wave started in, it took us a little bit of a time, between 6 and 9 to complete. The second wave was mostly after the eruption of the Arab Spring. There were few waves that were conducted before. And the third wave was immediately after the Arab Spring. The fourth was in 16, and the latest was the fifth in late 18, November, December 18, and between January and June 19. Because if it is a large sample, the margin of error in this survey is actually, in the fifth one, is just 2%. Okay, so this is basically the outline of my talk. I have a lot of slides. I'm not going, hopefully, to stop at each one in details. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview so that you can see what topics we are covering, what issues are of importance that we are focusing on. As you can see from the topics, we're trying to assess what are the challenges for people, how they assess economic conditions, their views of their own governance, liberties, democracy, social issues, particularly gender issues, the issue of immigration. The entire question of migration, of course, is an extremely important issue and has been for the last decade or so. So you'll see what really happened in terms of public attitudes during this period. We will focus a little bit on foreign policy, not a lot. I had to add one last slide this morning. The temptation was great to add one last slide on foreign policy. I hope some of you who are interested in foreign policy will find it useful. A lot about social media. Well, it will come at the end. So by then I will probably have spent a lot of time on other stuff. I won't be able to stop at the internet use, and trust in social media. So these basically are the issues that we will be looking at. I'll compare the fifth with the previous ones. Here are some of the major findings. The level of discontent is great. I don't think I have seen such level in any of our previous surveys. The discontent is essentially with government, but it's a much larger picture than that. There's, for example, discontent with democracy, with the concept itself as well. So we will be talking about democracy as well. The social picture is mixed. There are good news and not so good news. Perhaps one of the conclusions about the social trends is that if any of you have been thinking about the Arab Spring and what good impact it had on social attitudes, well, think again. Islamism. You'll hear me talk about religiosity more than Islamism, but there will be some discussion of Islamism as well, and the trend in this regard. We have much clearer evidence with regard to religiosity. Islamism is not an easy concept to measure, so my conclusions about Islamism are not going to be as definite as they are about religiosity. Religiosity itself is not easy to measure as well, but at least there we have a little bit more information and clearer trends from the past. Brain drain is one of my greatest conclusions with regard to immigration. You'll clearly see that the Middle East and North Africa are essentially losing their young, educated people. Their wealth essentially is migrating to Europe and the United States. That's a very, very serious problem for the region. On the regional international politics, there is no doubt that on the Israeli-Arab question, the Iran question, Iran-Turkey question, Iran-Turkey, by the way, was the last slide that I added, and on the larger picture between China and the US, I will be referring to some of those. Unfortunately for those, there isn't going to be any comparisons with the past because some of those were things that we added only recently. Asian income. I've selected Asian income to focus on. You'll see that when it comes to age, there are clearly some, well, first of all, let me also acknowledge that for the most part, there are no differences, major differences between young and old, for the most part. But the areas where there are differences are extremely significant. One of those areas you'll say is the question of immigration. That's a major issue. We will see major differences with regard to religiosity. With regard to the first one, of course, young people want to immigrate a lot more than older people. Young people are less religious. The third issue is about liberalism. Arab youth are more liberal than its older counterpart. There is much greater frustration in the street among the youth. And the youth are a lot more willing to go down the street than the older generation. The younger generation is a lot more interested in social media, using the internet, of course, but the interest in social media is much greater. And most importantly, the younger generation is a lot more willing to trust social media than older generation. With regard to income, by the way, with regard to age, think of two countries in particular. I will highlight these two countries as I speak, but if you look at the slides, you'll see that Morocco and Egypt are extremely sensitive to age. Young and old in these two countries will show up in almost every slide where I show age. With regard to income, well, the country that wins the race in terms of social polarization is actually Egypt. And here we will clearly see that the rich thinks differently than the poor. No surprise, I guess. We will see the rich much less frustrated. The level of discontent among the poor is much greater. One thing about the rich that must also be acknowledged, they are more liberal than the poor, the findings show.